what, I thought I'd show my face on this slide. This particular chapter is called Emergent Adulthood, and the previous edition of the text did not have it. This edition obviously does. This is a growing trend in developmental psychology, and I think it's a good one. I decided to include a TED Talk that featured the creator of this concept, the original study, and of course there's been tons of research since then, but I thought it'd be useful for you to meet him and hear from him directly. The clip is 11 minutes, so it's not short, but it's not long either. Definitely please view it because I pulled more than one question out of it for your lecture quiz. We'll say at this point that emergent adulthood is the ages from adolescence to young adulthood, but in terms of a number, I'll have you add that later on as you listen to future narrations. And the theorists you will get directly from this TED Talk. So go ahead and jump into it, and I hope you find it interesting. So hopefully you're well acquainted now with Jeffrey Arnett from the TED Talk and his concept of emerging adulthood. To give you more specific information, the actual years we should know, that would be from 18 to 25. Giving you a little bit more background, he coined the term based on his research in the year 2000, and as I mentioned, it's gaining popularity and it's becoming more and more frequent in lifespan books, and eventually I suspect it will be in all of them. It's thought to be a needed concept because there's a time that is now needed between adolescence and taking on full adult responsibilities. What are some of the relevant factors in need for this time? Well, a major driving force is the need for advanced education. We'll consider this in future slides. So you're obviously aware of that directly and personally because if you're viewing this, you are in college. There's also delayed societal pressure and probably personal pressure for achieving milestones. So stop for a moment and consider maybe the typical person that's in this emergent adulthood age. What milestones will they be gaining or perhaps passing on that many people do choose in, say, the next 10 years? So again, think of upcoming milestones, assuming that you're not already past this age or in the middle of it. Well, some milestones will be related to college, getting your certificate or your associates, your bachelor's, or maybe you're going on to an advanced degree. At some point, you may buy a car. People in large cities such as New York or maybe Albany or Schenectady maybe won't need to do this, but for many individuals, it's owning their own car. Moving out of your parents' dwelling, whether that's an apartment or a house. Choosing to cohabitate and or marry and or children. Many individuals choose to buy a home, but in many cities this is just plain not possible. But these are some of the milestones, and you might have thought of one or two that I didn't list, and you're probably quite correct on them. So is emerging adulthood a universal stage? Well, let's go back and start with the original study. The original study was performed by, as we noted, Jeffrey Arnett. He was a faculty member of Clark University. That's just over 2 hours from SCCC. The original study had a group of 300, which is respectable, which is absolutely respectable. But let's consider, is that a culturally universal concept that applies to most, or at least much of the world? Well, there's been considerable research by Arnett and many others since then, and it appears to be a stage associated specifically with Western nations. Now, I'm sure you've heard the phrase Western nations many times, but you might not know exactly what is meant by Western nation. Are Western nations most of the world, much of the world? Well, Western nations are defined as those nations which have membership in the OECD. And what is that? Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development. Do you need to know that? No, you do not. I'll even say it again, though, but you do not need to know that. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So these nations, with one strange exception, are the affluent nations of the world. They would include US and Canada, much of Europe, Greece, most of the Scandinavian countries, Japan and Korea, Israel, both Australia and New Zealand, 2 South American countries, specifically Colombia and Chile, 1 Central American country, that of Costa Rica, which is apparently the most affluent country. Many Americans decide to retire down there. It gives you the joys of the climate of Florida without your home likely to sink in the ocean. At least much of Florida is going to go underwater. Definitely in your lifetime and probably in my lifetime. And the last country, which is a little bit surprising because it's not an affluent country, would be Mexico. So Western nations are those specific nations with membership in this organization. In those countries, with again the exception of Mexico, need much more educated citizenry to fill many of the nation's jobs. So of those Western countries, is that 75% of the world, half the world, a third of the world? Actually, much less than that. The Western nations comprise a little less than 20% of the world. So what of the 80+% of the world? Well, much less educational attainment for the average citizen, much more likely to experience severe illness, and younger, depending on the society, much more violence than the US or not, a much higher rate of death at all ages, and a much shorter lifespan, depending on the particular country. So this emerging adulthood is by far a universal stage. Basically, it's a Western nation-specific stage, and we'll consider more details in the upcoming slides. The picture of the world there shows you the countries in bluish that are actually members of the OECD. And you can see not covering a lot of the world continents. I didn't mention, but probably should have, that amongst the non-OECD membership, another universal is a much, much lower median income. For example, in Guatemala, I have a partner that's there right now. In Guatemala, the average monthly income is $500. And you might say, well, $500, yes, but don't they pay a lot less for food and housing? Very true, but they have no manufacturing almost whatsoever other than things made locally for locals. So if you need anything that's non-local, such as a light bulb, if you wanted a refrigerator, well, some people use that as a business where they rent refrigerator space and freezer space to their neighbors who have no way of cooling their food products. Anyway, even though the costs of the indigenous goods are in line with the yearly and monthly salary, when you buy from the West, you pay Western prices, so a light bulb down there would be $8, which would be more than most people's salary for a day. When talking about nations slash countries, those words are interchangeable. The ones that are not members of the OECD, in other words, the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, that's a mouthful. Anyway, you can call those countries developing countries or economically developing countries, or emerging countries, or perhaps even underdeveloped countries or nations. Just avoid the phrase third world nation. It smacks of imperialism and ecocentrism, which is not a real word but really should be. So avoid that phrase. I wouldn't go so far to say if you hear a teacher say it, you could say, oh, I thought we're not supposed to say that word anymore, but it's up to you. Let's continue our exploration of Arnett's emerging adulthood. As noted earlier, since it's associated with more affluent cultures, it is not a stage that would be present in all cultures. It is positively correlated with a nation's wealth. It's captured by that in-between feeling, not an adolescent, but not an adult. It's a time of identity exploration. Remember Marcia's 4 different types of identity exploration levels. This is a self-focused time, and that's okay. It's a time with relatively few obligations compared to that of later young adulthood or middle adulthood, or definitely late adulthood. It's a time of instability and great change. There are fewer pressures. One's not paying for one's house, feeling the pressures of family, providing for children. It's a time of much more freedom and so many possibilities. Which 5 features of the ones on the previous slide did Arnett focus on? Well, you can see identity exploration, figure out who you are, and all that goes with that. An age of instability, of change, of fluctuation, of being very self-focused, and that is okay. The age of feeling neither and both, the age of feeling in between, and the age of so many possibilities and so many choices. For example, sexual orientation and gender identity. You might say, well, that's not choice. Yes, there is. You can be either true to yourself, you can live your real truth, or you might be forced by circumstance to not live that. Not healthy, clearly. I've had many students unfortunately share with me that to live in their house, they could not express their true gender or their sexual orientation, either for fear they'd be tossed out or being told explicitly they'd be tossed out. In many countries of the world, 64 right now to be exact, it is a crime to be LGBT plus, at least to act on it. Punishments can range from flogging to imprisonment to even execution. So things in the world are not good in that area, and things in the U.S., if you follow the news at all, you know, are getting less and less satisfactory, and many people think it's okay to deny other people's civil rights based on their personal or religious viewpoints. Obviously, I don't agree. But anyway, it's not an age just of that. It's also an age of, will you have body ornamentation or not? Remember that some of those are very permanent, and your employer might not hire you based on that. So, word to the wise, will you be very religious? Will you change the religion that you were brought up with? Will you volunteer? Will you be active in politics the same as your family or very different? What are your beliefs? Are you vegetarian or not? Vegan or not? Will you live in your parents' home and save money, or maybe live in a place that has much more freedom and you're able to express yourself? Will you stay in New York? Will you stay in the Northeast? Will you stay in the United States? Education, I see you've already made one choice, at least temporarily, and I think it's a good choice. So anyway, so many choices. If this is a live class, I would ask you for more examples, and I'm sure you can come up with many more. Unfortunately, we're not a live class, as you know. If you're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, do you feel like you've reached adulthood? You may say no, but if I ask you, do you still feel like you're an adolescent, you would probably say, well, that doesn't feel comfortable either. Well, perhaps you are experiencing the concept of emerging adulthood. Now look at the following figure and look at by age when people are asked, do you feel that you've reached adulthood? You can see by the earliest years of late adolescence and early adulthood, most people do not indicate a yes. We know that emerging adulthood is a time of instability. It's an inherent feature of that time. There's explorations going on in all sorts of areas, in education, in work, in probably or perhaps relationships, perhaps identity, so many things. But an example would be this in region, in where the person lives, the actual location. The age of emerging adulthood is the age of highest relocation. It might be within a city or across a state or across from side to side of the country or what have you. But again, young adulthood is associated with the greatest number of resident changes. So moving out of your parents' house to a dormitory, a private apartment, share with friends, share with strangers, moving back into your parents' house, and so on. It's all part of that age. Let's consider tertiary education, often called post-secondary education, refers to formal education beyond the high school. It could be a MD, PhD, bachelor's degree, associate's degree, or even a certificate or even a micro-credential. So it's any formal education beyond high school. So clearly taking a baking class to learn how to make sourdough bread won't count, but if it's a certificate or micro-credential, absolutely. As you learned in the TED Talk, hopefully, that in the not so distant past, probably the time of our grandparents, a high school education was an uncommon luxury. Only 25% of people graduated from high school. Most people stepped out at or by the 8th grade. So again, only 25%. And going to college, roughly 5%. Why? It was a luxury. It was not a necessity. We had a great many more people working in agriculture at that time. Most women did not work in the workforce. A man could get a job at a factory and his wife could stay home, take care of the kids and house, and they could live comfortably with a house and a car and a vacation. Nowadays, unless that job is exceptional, that's just not possible. And also many women don't necessarily want to be forced into that particular role. Choice is one thing, forced is another. So again, we've changed tremendously. Take a look at the map below and you might find some interesting things. So if you looked at the map, you see it looks at the states in the U.S. that offer free college education to some degree or fully, and you'll see that New York State is shown in green, which is a good color to be on in this map. So in part, why are more people undergoing tertiary education? It's now affordable. I assume that you're familiar with New York State's very generous Excelsior Scholarship. To be eligible, you need to be a New York State resident. If you're not, stick around a year, get it documented, address and so on, bills. Attend a SUNY or CUNY 2 or 4-year program. Take 30 credits per calendar year, which could be 12 in the January session, 12 in the fall session, and 6 in the summer session. Divvy up however you like. And you just have to plan to live and work in the state following graduation for at least as long as you participate in the particular program. So if you were using the scholarship for 2 years, you just merely have to stay in the state for 2 years during your work life subsequent to graduation. Pretty generous, pretty generous. Students who opt to do a private college sometimes get very generous financial aid assistance, but bear that in mind. Many students graduate from a private college. I know somebody, massive debt, and she would have graduated with minimal debt from a SUNY college. So just bear that in mind. Look to your fiscal future and how much you'd have to pay every month for how long, which could delay other things in your life, such as home buying if you care for, house buy, home, car, etc., etc. So look at the big picture and make what decision is best for you. Let's consider today's college graduation rate and who these students are. According to the most recent U.S. Census, 95% of the current American population has completed high school or has an equivalency degree. Your text lists 90%, but I go with the more recent data since your text's been published. 1/3 of the population has a bachelor's degree or higher, but that's an average. It varies very considerably by both gender and race. So let's consider these specifics now. In terms of overall college graduation rates, a little less than half, 40% of the population graduates from college. For women, all races, all ethnicities, they are more likely to get an advanced degree as compared to men. Breaking it down by race and ethnicity, for African Americans, just under 1/3 graduate from college. For Hispanic Americans, a lower number at 20%. For Asian Americans, a very impressive 60%. A word of advice here, our graduation rate is 50%, and that's what the norm is for all the 2- and 4-year colleges. Some students, for whatever reasons, do not succeed. If you have having trouble, reach out to your teachers, reach out to your success coaches, your academic advisor, Sean Mullen, our counselor, anybody who might provide you the service that you might need. If it's not a good time and you step out, remember that we're here, and that many times after working in a job and you find it's not for you, a person is ready and many of the issues have resolved themselves, and the person's older and wiser and more resilient. So keep your eye on the prize, long term versus short term. Let's now compare emerging adulthood in Asian versus European-based cultures, focusing specifically on the OECD cultures. There's a far less emphasis on individualism, and concurrently a great responsibility, I won't say even greater, I'll say great responsibility felt for family obligations. What about college? You probably chose your college, your program, your future career. With Asian emerging adults, far less so. The parents might make the final decision on the college, the program, even the future career. In terms of where that person resides, whether it's at home or at college, or whether you accept the job far away versus local, the parents probably have the final say on that, not the individual, which would not work with most Americans. Some Americans, yes, if that includes your family, but for most American families, no, it would not work that way. Fiscal independence. For a Western-based individual, it means being able to pay your own bills, maybe to afford your own apartment, maybe to afford your car payments, maybe to make a purchase of a townhouse or a trailer, a home. In Asian cultures, fiscal independence means that you can support your parents. So you look forward to not all the things that you can do with your money for yourself, but being able to provide for your parents in their old age. So some very different perspectives. And it's always good to remember that American and Western cultures are not the only people, not the only cultures of this world. Let's consider how emerging adults date by age group. Overall, 30% of Americans that are of adult age, and also including emerging adults, have used online dating. So roughly a third. Now, if you look at the three age blocks, although you might suspect perhaps that emerging adults might be the highest users, nowhere near. Users aged 30 to 49 are by far more than twice as likely to use online dating. Let's now consider sexuality in emerging adulthood in Asian OECD cultures. Again, remember, less than 20% of cultures are Western-based developed countries. So our partners in OECD, the Asian cultures, should really be looked at in this course, and we are. Now, dating in the U.S. is pretty normative for even youth, so maybe a parent wouldn't be too thrilled with a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old dating, but few parents would consider question dating in, say, upper teens, say 18 when emerging adulthood begins, and virtually no parent would discourage dating, at least relatively few, I will say, would discourage dating in the 20s. And yet, in various OECD Asian cultures, dating in young 20s is not acceptable. Dating is only acceptable when one is specifically looking for a partner in marriage. And at that age, parents often prefer their children not to be quite into that stage yet. So even dating is done differently. Premarital sex, the norm in most Western cultures, especially the United States. 3/4 of emerging adults will have intercourse. It is not at all that case in Asian cultures such as Korea or Japan. Less than 20% of that age would have had intercourse, so most versus very few. There's also a very much smaller problem with unintended pregnancies, of course, in those countries. Also consider cohabitation. It's normative in this culture. Most people will cohabitate. I will say that less than half of those relationships do lead to a permanent long-term or relatively permanent long-term arrangement. But cohabitation is the norm. Not necessarily designed to lead to marriage, but cohabitation in most Asian OECD cultures is just totally unacceptable. So don't forget to look at your world lens when considering issues related to this course. I was a little intrigued by the slide, so did a little further research. In Japan, apparently, dates often begin with what's called a confession, where one person indicates they have feelings for another. For us, that'd be putting the cart ahead of the horse, but apparently going out as friends is so common, even with people you don't know well, that it's got to be clearly indicated that it's a date and not just a lunch. Dates are often a day long, so imagine when we often want to do a date at, say, a coffee shop or something where you can get in and get out if it doesn't work. Often their dates are a full day long. They also have what's called the stay-at-home date. Imagine you're just getting to know somebody and you stay all day long, hanging out at their apartment or house. Okay. If you meet the parents, marriage is in the air. And of course, there are no PDAs, public displays of affection, at any age. That's just rude. Let's consider sexuality in earlier young adulthood. As compared to the college years, there'll be less hookups and fewer friends with benefits. Very similar to the LGBT population. As a tendency, that particular group tend to live in college towns or cities. And luckily, the approval for same-sex marriage has increased every year. So, as the videos used to say, things are getting better. Let's consider education and marriage in the developing nations. The majority of the population across the many countries still marries around age 20, which is much earlier, obviously, than the American population. They have long finished their education by the teens. Emergent adulthood is seen in a few of these countries, not all certainly, and limited to the middle and upper class. It's very low, but is still increasing. It is rising. In the very poorest of these countries, even adolescence might not be a common age of life. You go right from childhood jumping into adult work and even marriage responsibilities. Work and marriage might begin in the middle or even early teens, and sometimes earlier. In poor, specifically South Asian developing countries, up to half marry before age 18. Shown in the picture is two 13-year-olds being married. Let's now consider the entire span of young adulthood and look at possible milestones. Certainly, not every person experiences each of these milestones. First one, leaving home, moving out from one's parents' house or apartment. Though very commonly, we move back in and move back out, and many times move back in again. Completing one's education, at least perhaps for the time being. Beginning full-time work. Your maybe not forever job, but perhaps a step in the rung of what might be your forever job, if there's even that concept nowadays. Economic independence, being able to pay your own bills, make your own way. Finding a long-term partner, perhaps buying a home, or perhaps not. And perhaps starting a family, or again, perhaps not. The timing varies tremendously, as you might know. If you're interested in the average age of marriage for the OECD countries, and for the US, it's within a few months of being the same, so we'll just say age 32. Men 1 year older on the average, women 1 year younger, but let's just say 32 to make life easy for everybody. Let's consider worldview in emerging and young adulthood. Degree of narcissism. Americans have been called a narcissistic culture. Does narcissism increase, decrease, stay the same? Well, there's a consistency in both older and the newest research saying the degree of narcissism is actually increasing in American youth, most definitely including emerging and young adulthood. What are some things that might be potentially related to this? Self-focus. Well, the opposite would be volunteerism, focusing on others. Volunteerism is the lowest in emerging adulthood and the early part of young adulthood. Interestingly, at the tail end, or even more appropriately said, middle, from middle to the tail end of young adulthood is the highest rate of volunteerism. So interesting contradictions. Voting, interesting one's country, fellow citizens. In terms of the last election, the age block most likely to vote were the seniors, the 65 plus group. 2/3 of them voted. In terms of young adults and emerging adults, what percent do you think voted? A sad 1/3, in other words, 33%. If the young adults and emerging adults voted as a block, they could take the election in any way they wished. But unfortunately, might be passionate, but passion without action is talking. So please vote. Let's now consider identity, starting with the perspective of Erik Erikson. His time associated with adolescence is identity versus role confusion. This is a time to explore identity. It would include all sorts of aspects of identity, from self, religion, sexuality, career. It's also a time of growing independence from parents, doing things on your own, getting around on your own, making life decisions on your own. Now let's turn our attention to Erik Erikson's theory. Now, since we've been doing Erik Erikson for every module, in other words, for every age group, be sure for our next test to be able to answer questions about his previous stages. You may well see something on this. But let's focus on the stage associated with young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. The former term, that is intimacy, refers to not physical intimacy, but psychological, emotional intimacy, and the ability to make a commitment. This includes especially to one's partner, but intimacy also includes with our friends. The latter term, isolation, will be those people, for whatever reason, are unwilling or unable to form intimate bonds, intimate relationships. You probably noticed that the slide referred to young adulthood, and we're in the emerging adulthood age. But remember, emerging adulthood straddles both the stage of identity versus role confusion, and also intimacy versus isolation. So in the textbook prior to the emergent adulthood becoming a full module, that age group was squarely within young adulthood. So the reason for the change. If a person is unable to find these relationships, they might greatly desire to have relationships, but being unable to form them. In the most extreme form, it would be a personality disorder called avoidant personality disorder, or a person who doesn't form relationships and has absolutely no need for human relationships, also personality disorder called schizoid personality disorder. Let's consider an extension of Erikson's work by James Marcia. Marcia identifies 4 different identity statuses, as you can see. First one, diffusion. The individual has not yet begun to explore the identity dimension. This is often early in the process, but it can also continue. Let's next consider foreclosure. This person has accepted the identity they were given to them. Perhaps they accept the family religion without ever really considering it. Maybe they consider the family trade is their career and don't even consider that there might be a choice in it. Maybe they consider that having children will just happen and they really don't decide whether or not they can choose. It's just a given in their life. So many people do go directly into foreclosure status. Next, let's consider moratorium. This person is actively exploring. Do I want to go to college or not? Do I want my parents' family business or not, perhaps? So actively exploring their choices. Lastly, let's consider achievement. The person has gone through the active exploration, that is, they have gone through moratorium, and now they have committed. This does not mean that they can't change along the way, but they have a very distinct goal plan, if you will. Where are you in this? Now, if you're curious about the 2 pictures on the bottom, they're the same group. Left is showing a bunch of Amish teens hanging out, as teens often do. And the right, another group of Amish teens, and that kind of might not match your picture of what Amish are. We have Amish in our area. They're often seen in horse and buggies. They are allowed to accept rides from the English, as they call us, or pay for rides for certain things they might need, like a medical appointment in a city. You might think that an Amish youth would go directly into foreclosure, but most Amish groups in the country have a tradition called rumspringa. It's like the word rum and then spring, in which they're allowed to try all sorts of things that would be forbidden for a traditional Amish person. So riding in cars, smoking, going to malls, dressing non-traditionally, you name it. Most things are allowed to be experienced. At the end of Rumspringa, they must either decide to not be Amish, or if they decide to be Amish, they will be baptized as an adult. And at that point, they must keep Amish values. If they break away or break the values at that point, they can be shunned, which means that they will not be talked to or included or interacted with by any Amish person, so it's very severe. So they don't have to accept the Amish lifestyle. Actually, many don't. Most do, though. But again, it's the choice of must be made, and once baptism is made, that's a vow that's tremendously serious and cannot be taken back or violated. So if you thought that they went into foreclosure, no, not at all. I should share that the word Rumspringa is German. Pennsylvania Dutch is really from the term Deutsch. Deutsch is how Germans refer to themselves because they were German people, not Dutch people. But in German, Rumspringa means literally to run around or to run about, which kind of captures the some of the essence of it. So let's consider the famous hierarchy of needs. Who is that gentleman on the right? And it's not Mr. Sim. That's apparently a pretty gifted artist. So whose hierarchy? And while we're at it, which approach to psychology is this hierarchy associated with? You might be saying, the names of the sages are in the wrong language. No, I had to look quite a bit to find that. I would also like you to think, and perhaps in your notes, list these stages of hierarchy in correct order. And lastly, well, which of these levels will our chapter focus on? So think on those points and click once you've answered them all. So again, who was that guy? What was the name of the approach that guy in this pyramid is associated with? What are those 5 levels? And lastly, which one do you think will be key for our particular chapter? So the gentleman would be one Abraham Maslow with his famous hierarchy of needs. Which approach was it? Psychodynamic, Gestalt, socioculture, humanistic, behavioral? Well, it wasn't a B because the behaviors were the B people and he's Abraham Maslow. Hopefully you said humanistic or perhaps humanism. In terms of the stages, was the bottom stage, stage number 1, psychological or physiological? Quite a difference. You're taking a psychology course now, not a physiology course. So the bottom one would be your physiological needs, or if you prefer basic, and let's not go with the term basic, let's go with maybe biological. Things you need for your survival. Next stage, stage 2, that would be safety. Middle stage, stage 3, love and belongingness. Next, not self-esteem, but stage 4 is all varieties of esteem. And stage 5, well, self-actualization. In terms of which one will this chapter focus on? Well, the middle one, shown in green, stage 3, love and belongingness. So this chapter focuses on love and relationships. So let's ask, is it normal, quote unquote, not to want to have a romantic relationship? Well, some of us identify their sexual orientation as being aces. Are you familiar with the term? What does ACEs stand for? So ACEs, please notice the lowercase letters, stands for asexual. Now, people that identify as ACEs, some want romantic relationships without the sexual component. They want a partnered relationship. Others, although want people in their lives, don't want a partnered type relationship. So the term ACEs can be used in either way. Now, sometimes a lack of desire to have relationships in general can reflect a psychological disorder. More specifically, if the person has no use for other people, desires basically no physical contact or psychological contact, if they desire no interaction, whether it's relationships or even small talk, well, they probably meet the criteria of schizoid personality disorder. On the other hand, people with avoidant personality disorder strongly desire relationships, often think about it, fantasize about it, but they're unable to take the risk for fear of rejection. They're too fragile psychologically to put themselves out there and take the risk. So that would also meet the criteria of a different personality disorder. That one would be the avoidant personality disorder. But perhaps all these labels we're using, perhaps they reflect a societal prejudice held by a majority in terms of what people should want in their lives. If you can think of our society in years, decades, or centuries past, can you think of other strongly held societal relationship prejudice about who can love whom? So think about it. Many of these relationships are very acceptable for most Americans today, but what relationships were not considered to be acceptable in the past, but are well within today's social norms? Think about it for me. I'd like to share that I'm just finishing a book by Trevor Noah. He is a talk show host / comedian, a South African. And he shared that he was born literally a crime, his parents, mother being black, his father being white. To have intercourse with those two people in South Africa was nothing short of a crime. And so you might have been thinking perhaps of LGBT in that particular question I posed, which is still a very good answer, but also can be related to color and many other factors that most of us would consider rather perhaps irrelevant. So now that we've become familiar with equity theory and social exchange theory, let's return to attachment theory. We saw earlier that early attachment provides foundations for current relationships and future relationships. So let's explore this much further. Let's now look at a very recognized theory of love and relationships. This is a three-tier theory. Different combinations for each person of intimacy, which is before refers to psychological closeness, passion, which is the heat, the sexual closeness, and commitment, how much or maybe how little one is dedicated to the relationship. So you and other people can have any combination of all three. So the best, presumably, would be a relationship that had all three: intimacy, passion, and commitment. The worst, perhaps, within relationships anyway, would be empty love, in which the people are committed to staying together, but they have nothing. They basically have nothing. They have no intimacy. They have no passion. We probably should recognize the author associated with the triangle theory of love or relationships. His name should be familiar to you, Robert Sternberg. Now, if you think a moment and are confused, well, didn't he have another triangular or triarchic theory for intelligence? Indeed he is. This is the same Robert Sternberg. What is love? Well, perhaps one of the most well-known researchers in that area is Sternberg, Robert Sternberg, that is, and he proposed his triarchical, or triarchic, if you will, theory of love. Now, Sternberg rings a bell, or the term triarchic or triarchical. He also has a very well-received and very well-recognized triarchic theory of intelligence as well. In Sternberg's triarchic theory specifically of love, he believes that three dimensions define it are essential: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Not every marriage has all three. So take a moment, consider your parents, or whoever raised you, that is, a type of relationship they had with their partner. Although you're not doomed, or blessed if you prefer, depending on the relationship, destined to follow in their footsteps, there is a strong tendency to use our parents as role models for good and for bad. So take a moment and consider what type of relationship your parents had with each other. And consider, do you wish this for yourself? So let's consider the factors that have the greatest impact on whether we form a friendship or a romantic relationship with another person. These factors are the most essential and therefore also the most studied. As you can see, they're reciprocity, the similarity versus difference factor, physical proximity, familiarity, attractiveness, and the most fun one to talk about, especially in a live class, lack of deal breakers. We will consider all of these. Let's consider physical attractiveness. The physically attractive not only reap the benefits of being physically attractive, they also reap the considerable benefits of the halo effect. The halo effect is that people typically, when they see an attractive person, assume that they are above average in other abilities and areas as well. For example, as you see on the slide, competence, happiness, intelligence, likableness, successfulness, and just about everything else that they've been researched on. So be wary of this tendency because we all do it. We assume that, oh, they're attractive, so they're honest, they're attractive, they're outgoing, they're attractive, they'll be the best candidate, they're attractive, and so on. Be wary. In fact, in my personal experience with very attractive people, they will sometimes take advantage of this, and basically they are not necessarily held to the same standards as everybody else. They almost use it as a crutch, so to speak. So be mindful of the halo effect. So let's begin with reciprocity, which is fun to say, I'll admit. We like someone better if they like us. It's flattery. It stokes our ego. It makes us give them a second look. So definitely reciprocity. Now let's consider similarity versus difference. Let's take a pause. Can you think of any sayings, and there's actually quite a few, about people in terms of similarity or difference as being more important? Take a moment and see if you can come up with a couple of these famous sayings. So for similarity, how about birds of a feather? Like two peas in a pod, dancing to the same music. For opposite, well, opposites attract comes to mind. How did you do? So if studies compare couples in terms of same race or different race, religion, socioeconomic status, education, intelligence, they will be more like that person than strangers having been paired for the study. Personality traits, less so. Now let's consider physical proximity. You're more likely to become friends or romantically involved with people that are close to you physically. So if you look in a standard classroom, you're most likely to form a friendship or partnership with the people that sit around you, one person in every direction. If you look at dormitories, for example, you are twice as likely to form a friendship with the people that live across the hall to you, one room to the left, or one room to the right, as compared to people just one more room away. I think back to one particular college year. There's a bathroom on one side, so that doesn't count, but we were best friends with the people across the hall and very good friends with the people that lived directly above our head because we chatted out the window so much and became friends. The other room, not so, and don't ask me why, it's too many decades ago. So physical proximity is important. Can you think of anything that we've discussed in the course that explains why physical proximity? Any effects? So you're getting exposed to these people more and you'll have an enhanced liking. So think about that for a moment. So if you said validity effect, nice try, but that's the more you get exposed, the more you believe it to be true. This one would be the mere exposure effect. The more you get exposed to something, the more you tend to like it. But either way, good try if you came up with anything at all. Earlier, when discussing physical proximity, we tried to identify why that increases the likelihood of relationships, and we said it was due to familiarity, in other words, the mere exposure effect. This just doesn't apply to people with other people. Consider on the bottom the Eiffel Tower. If you saw the movie French Kiss, she was always looking for a glimpse of the tower. And most people, when they go to Paris, and if I ever make it, I want to see the Eiffel Tower. I also want to see, if I ever get to San Francisco, and I'm knock on wood I will, I want to see the Golden Gate Bridge, the picture that you see in the TV shows. Why are they interesting, or the picture on the right? Because the more we see them, the more we find them attractive. The French people, the Parisians, found the original Eiffel Tower to be a monstrosity. Consider our face. If we're shown experimentally a picture of our face how we see it, or a mirror image like we see in a mirror, which do we prefer? Well, we prefer what we see the most. We prefer the mirror image, but we'll be hard pressed to say why we like that particular picture better. So the mere exposure effect says the more we get exposed to something, the more we tend to like it. Yes, it can go too far when we get sick of something, but in general, as long as we don't hate it, as long as we're neutral on it or like it a little, the more we get exposed, the more we like it. Stop for a moment and think of as many examples as you can. There should be quite a few. It might be a particular food that you didn't care for, but now you love. Maybe the first time you had a sip of beer, you might find bitter, and maybe you now enjoy it. It might be a style of clothing. You may have made fun of it, and now you're wearing it, or a form of body ornamentation that you thought ridiculous. Now you're sporting it. It could be an activity that you felt really uncomfortable with, but now you enjoy it. My best answer from a student was my husband, and we all got quite a laugh out of that. So, in general, whether it's food, people, activities, it holds, and that's the mere exposure effect. And that works on relationships too. So don't be a stalker, but remember my student who said, my husband. So let's consider attractiveness. You might think that we all seek the most attractive partner we can possibly get, but research does not bear that out. According to matching theory, we seek people with a similar level of attractiveness to avoid rejection. If you're, say, a 5 and you're looking at a 10, well, you're probably going to get rejected by the 10 who's also looking for a fellow 10. But people with lower levels of attractiveness can compensate by bringing other things to the table. Take a moment. What else could they bring to the table other than being attractive? So perhaps you consider the picture on the right. Jay there brings to the table older age. Women generally prefer partners that are slightly older as compared to men who prefer partners that are younger. So he's bringing slightly over age in this particular situation. Probably too much. It's become a detraction. But what he brings to the table is he knows himself, he's assured of himself, and he's got lots of money. So you can bring to the table, if you're a guy, slightly older age. You can bring money to the table. Or for anybody, being funny, or being talented, or just being a wonderfully warm person. So there are many things we can bring to the table. It does not have to necessarily bring looks. So these are suggestions from previous classes. I teach human sexuality, and this is a topic in that class as well. So if you take me in that class or have taken me, you'll probably recognize that gentleman on the right. Okay, him being shorter, being 5'9 and a half. This is not on my list whatsoever. Not working. Now, not so much a problem when they're, say, in school, going part-time or full-time, but maybe more problematic if he's just not working in general or hasn't worked in a long time. No car. Again, probably shouldn't be a concern if the person is 19 or 22, but if the person's 30 and does not live in a big city, well, that can be problematic. Poor hygiene, I think, is on most people's charts. Not being respectful or just being rude. Having drug issues. Having a criminal record. Weight not within whatever you prefer. Cheating. Living at home. Signs of domestic violence. Not being responsible. Arrest record. For some people, bald, and bad teeth for a lot of us. I can think of my circle of friends and the saying, if you find them in a bar, leave them in a bar comes to mind. Also, if the person is 30 or older and is living at home or does not have a stable job unless they've been recently laid off, again, that should screen warning signs. Let's now consider the concept of a deal breaker, something when present would preclude you wanting to be a friend of the person or having a romantic partnership. Write down, if you will, a list, and then proceed to the next slide and see if there's any ones that you forgot or you would like to add to your list. So these are suggestions from previous classes. I teach human sexuality, and this is a topic in that class as well. So if you take me in that class or have taken me, you'll probably recognize that gentleman on the right. Okay, him being shorter, being 5'9½". This is not on my list whatsoever. Not working. Now, not so much a problem when they're, say, in school, going part-time or full-time, but maybe more problematic if he's just not working in general or hasn't worked in a long time. No car. Again, probably shouldn't be a concern if the person is 19 or 22, but if the person's 30 and does not live in a big city, well, that can be problematic. Poor hygiene, I think, is on most people's charts. Not being respectful or just being rude. Having drug issues. Having a criminal record. Wait, not within whatever you prefer. Cheating. Living at home. Signs of domestic violence. Not being responsible. Arrest record. For some people, bald, and bad teeth for a lot of us. I can think of my circle of friends and the saying, if you find them in a bar, leave them in a bar comes to mind. Also, if the person is 30 or older and is living at home or does not have a stable job unless they've been recently laid off, again, that should screen warning signs. It's interesting that when people are asked to rate the attractiveness of their partner, they rate their partner's physical attractiveness as being higher than do strangers. So apparently we come to see each other as being more physically attractive. Now the downside is that if we meet somebody, for example, on a dating website or on a blind date or an arranged date, the physical attractiveness is much, much more important because in that situation, we haven't gotten time to let that person grow on us. So that person might have been a wonderful mate, but we didn't have time to start them to see them as more physically attractive than they really are. So sometimes those more artificial ways, and nowadays more common ways of meeting partners, have that as a distinct drawback as compared to maybe this is a friend of a friend that you hang out with without expecting a relationship, and then you see all their good qualities and their physicality, which was maybe not quite your cup of tea. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't have time to be discounted by the other positive features. So let's continue with this idea of attractiveness. Beauty standards, are they constant across cultures or there's considerable variability? Well, there's considerable variability. There are a couple features that are indeed constant, though. The constant features are facial symmetry, something that you probably wouldn't jump out to you unless it was extremely bad, but apparently the brain is designed to like facial symmetry. It predicts health, basically. Averageness and good skin. Let's consider body weight, for example. You would think that most cultures have the American preference of a slim physique, shown rather clearly on the right. This is also shown in American culture in the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties. At that time, flappers tried to de-emphasize their breasts and emphasize a slim physique. Most of our culture, though, we preferred a more full-figured woman such as Marilyn Monroe and the hourglass shape. Most cultures consider American women and Western women too thin. Consider in much of the world, poverty is a major issue, lack of food in much of the world is still a major issue, so you wouldn't want to look thin, it just announces that you're poor. Now consider the picture on the far right, the Dove's Real Beauty campaign. I like the spirit of it, but I think they rather dropped the ball. So they're trying to show us diversity. I think they're lacking in several major areas of diversity. Take a look. What else should they really include in this picture to capture American women better than they have? So they are doing a good job of showing Caucasian women and African American women, and they are showing African American women of different degrees of light and dark complexion. Great, but who else is missing? Well, the American culture has more than Caucasian and African Americans. Where are the Asian people or Indian people or Pacific Islanders? Okay, what about tall versus short? What about heavy? There are no extremely full-figured women, no uh, women that exceed the typical desirable weight. What about different levels of ability? Differentially abled women. And what jumps out at me, since I am post 50, where are women that are 30 years of age or older? So the spirit is good, but when somebody was reviewing this particular picture and concept, clearly they don't get it. And I hope we get it. So consider these slides. The woman on the left, I believe, is Maori, based on the facial tattoos. So generally, we don't find heavy facial tattooings on women attractive, but for her culture, absolutely. Consider the woman in the middle, the extreme stretching of the lip. My understanding of this particular custom was an anti-kidnapping, anti-slavery measure. They would do this typically less than this, though, to make the people less attractive so the slavers might leave that particular tribe alone, and eventually this particular anti-kidnapping body modification became a style of beauty and a cultural norm. Next, consider the woman with the neck rings. It's not that her neck becomes longer, it's just that they deform and push down her shoulders, and at this point she would actually need these rings to support her neck properly. Now consider the bottom, foot binding, if you wonder what her foot would look like, shown on the right. Pretty unattractive from my point of view. They actually break the foot, and no small number of women died of complications from having a fractured foot. Now, there's different degrees of this sort of binding. The most attractive, and most Chinese men find this to be very sexy, very attractive. The most attractive level of this is called the golden lotus. This woman has the golden lotus. The golden lotus is a foot that is 4 inches or less. And Asian women, Chinese women are shorter than Caucasian women as a group, but still 4 inches. She'd have to have constant pain and have a constant trouble navigating. So less common in the poor social classes that couldn't afford women to be disabled. So what is attractive and sexy in one culture often does not translate well to other cultures. Let's now take a look at partner selection. Let's start with, are partners more likely to be similar or different from us? And in chances of success, are we best off with partners of high similarity or dissimilarity? If you can, take a moment and think of famous sayings associated with this. You should hopefully be able to think of several, again, between being different or similar to our friends and especially romantic relationships. So there are many sayings, as similar as 2 peas in a pod, birds of the feather, opposites attract, dancing to the same music. So the sayings have it covered in either direction. But what does research say? In terms of our friendships and in terms of our romantic relationships, we are much more likely to form these relationships with people that are similar rather than people that are dissimilar. And in terms of the longevity of the relationship, in general, the greater the similarity, the greater robustness and longevity. What are women versus men looking for? To generalize, women are considerably more focused on that prospective suitor's financial success. Does that person have a good job? And also very focused on intellectual ability as well. Preferred partner age, well, does she want a younger or older partner? Typically, she prefers an older partner. Now, men, on the other hand, are much less concerned with the partners. We're assuming heterosexual men here, but the man is much less interested in her job, her fiscal success, even her intellectual level. He is particularly focused on attractiveness. And in terms of preferred partner age, I'm sure that you have no question on this. He typically prefers a younger partner. A look at dating websites for people that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s. Often the man will not even consider dating somebody his own age. Also consider the role of our parental relationship. Our parents serve as role models, as social learning theory would strongly suggest. Our parents' relationship becomes the norm, sets the expectations that will guide us, for better and sometimes for worse. Also consider back to our early years and our type of attachment. Our type of attachment as a child will strongly influence the type of attachment we're capable of as adults. This is not to say that it cannot be changed with effort, even perhaps therapy, but it is a foundation. Securely attached children will grow up to trust in relationships and be able to fully commit themselves. Individuals that experience either type of insecure attachment as a child may mistrust people and relationships, their motives, their fidelity. They might be anxious about being abandoned, perhaps, or afraid or just outright unable to commit. Consider for a moment your parents' relationship and see if you can see any signs of influence on your adult relationships if you have reached that stage yet. I thought I should add a little bit more specific information in terms of age preference. For women, heterosexual women that is, they do prefer in general men their own age or often older. Men indeed do prefer younger women, that is heterosexual men. In terms of a specific age group, the age considered to be the most attractive and beautiful would be the early 20s. The history of love and relationships is a very interesting topic we do touch on more extensively in human sexuality. Did you know that marrying for love is a rather newer and a particularly Western concept? In the past, marriage was an economic and political alliance between families. And even in Western culture, this was also true. Even today, as in the picture shown below, love before marriage is not expected. In various cultures, marriages are still arranged. If love is not required for marriage, then divorces due to the falling out of marriage also are unlikely to occur. We've been mentioning milestones that are associated with young adulthood. Let's consider your biggest fiscal decision. Take a moment and consider what one's biggest fiscal, in other words, financial choices will be in life. Buying a house might be one of them, but as you can see, it will typically not be our biggest fiscal decision. Think of some of the other ones, and then please go to the next slide. Did you think of going to college? Whether or not you go to college, and if you get a certificate, 2-year degree, 4-year degree, or beyond, will quite probably be the biggest fiscal decision you ever make. Getting a 4-year degree over a lifetime will net you about a little over $500,000 more. We looked at having a house, buying a house on the previous slide. No, not even close. I looked at the average home price in upstate New York, close to $400,000, though in Albany area, the median home price would be around $200,000, not even close to the money involved in college education in terms of earnings. If you want to consider having a child, well, that is a costly decision. It will cost you approaching $300,000, and that number that you see on the slide was to age 17. Children typically stay with parents well past 17 and often return more than a few times. Of course, this $265,000 would not include any help in college whatsoever.